At my son Julian's funeral, I watched my daughter-in-law Chloe play the part of the grieving widow. She was a study in practiced grief, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her shoulders trembling on cue. But as I stood over the polished mahogany of my son's casket, the scent of lilies thick in the air, I saw her eyes. They were deserts. There wasn't a drop of moisture in them. Hours later, back in the crushing silence of my own home, a friend texted me a screenshot. It was Chloe's latest Instagram post. There she was on a sun-drenched beach in Cancun, a vibrant blue cocktail in her hand smiling next to our gardener Marco. The caption was a knife twist, "Enjoy life while you can." A cold rage began to build in my chest, a feeling I hadn't known in years. Just then my phone vibrated. A new message, from Julian's number. My heart stopped. 6 words that defied all logic. "Dad, come to my house now." Before I tell you what I did next, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I want to know how far this story travels, so tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever felt that a situation was deeply wrong, even when everyone else acted like it was normal, this story is for you. I called Julian's number. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked to voicemail. The sound of my son's recorded voice, cheerful and alive, was a ghost in my ear. "Hey, you've reached Julian. Leave a message." I hung up without a word. My hands were steady, a discipline learned from 40 years as a forensic auditor, but my mind was a storm of irreconcilable facts. Grief, fury, and a sliver of impossible hope battled for control. Was this a prank of unimaginable cruelty? Had someone stolen his phone? Or was it something else, something that lived in the dark space between the plausible and the unthinkable? I grabbed my keys. Emotion is the enemy of truth, I told myself, a mantra from my old life. And I needed the truth more than I needed air. The drive to their house was short through quiet suburban streets lined with manicured lawns, each home a silent testament to a life I no longer understood. Julian's house, a modern structure of glass and steel that Chloe had insisted upon, was dark. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. I parked across the street, watching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The entire neighborhood was asleep, unaware of the tremor that was shaking my world to its foundation. I took a deep breath, pushing down the image of the casket, the scent of the lilies, the lie in Chloe's eyes. An auditor doesn't guess. An auditor gathers data. And the text message was a data point that needed investigation. I used the spare key Julian had given me years ago, a key I hadn't touched since my wife Clara passed. The lock clicked softly, an obscene sound in the profound silence. The air inside was cool and sterile, carrying Chloe's faint, expensive perfume. The house was immaculate, showroom clean, as if a life had been scrubbed from its walls. I walked through the living room, my footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floors. Every object, from the minimalist sofa to the abstract art on the wall, screamed Chloe's taste. There was nothing of my son here, none of his warmth, none of his chaotic, creative energy. I went straight to his office. This was Julian's sanctuary, the one room he had managed to keep for himself. It was still neat, but his presence lingered here. Books on architectural theory were stacked on the floor, sketches were pinned to a corkboard. It was here I knew that I would find an answer, if there was one to be found. My eyes scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. And then I saw it. On his desk, placed squarely in the center, was an old, leather-bound accounting ledger. It was the one I had given him when he graduated from college, a symbolic gift from my world of numbers to his world of lines and angles. It felt like a message. My fingers, wrinkled with age, trembled slightly as I ran them over the worn cover. I opened it. Tucked inside between 2 empty pages was a single folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a receipt dated 3 weeks before the accident. It was the first month's payment for a self-storage unit in an industrial park on the other side of town. It was paid for in cash. Julian knew my methods. He knew I believed in paper trails in evidence. He knew I would look past the obvious. This was no random document. This was a breadcrumb left for me and only me, a quiet signal from a place I couldn't comprehend, a clue pointing me toward a truth I was beginning to dread. I sat down in Julian's leather chair, the receipt clutched in my hand. The scent of old paper and ink filled my senses, and suddenly I could hear my wife Clara's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. We had been sitting in our own kitchen years ago after first meeting Chloe. Clara, who could read people like I read balance sheets, had a look of profound unease. "She doesn't love our son Elias," she had said, softly stirring her tea. "She loves his potential as a commodity. There's a beautiful vacancy in her, and she will throw his whole world into that emptiness to try and fill it." I had dismissed it then as a mother's overprotectiveness, a miscalculation I now regretted with every fiber of my being. Her words came back to me layered with the memories of the following years. The credit card statements I'd accidentally seen with figures that made my blood run cold. The new German sports car in the driveway that I knew Julian couldn't afford on an architect's salary. The hushed, tense arguments I'd overheard during holiday visits, always about money. I had seen the data points, but I had failed to connect them, blinded by the hope that my son was happy. I had allowed my love for him to obscure the cold, hard numbers. The numbers always tell a story, and I had refused to read it. Now, holding this receipt, I understood I was no longer just a grieving father. I was an auditor with a case to solve. And it was the most important case of my life. I knew I was out of my depth. This wasn't a corporate fraud case with neat columns and predictable patterns. This was messy, dangerous. I needed someone who understood the shadows, who knew the rules of a game I was only just beginning to learn. I pulled out my old, worn address book, its pages filled with the names of people from a lifetime of work and friendship. I flipped through the pages past the names of colleagues who were long retired or gone. Then I found it. David Sterling, Julian's best friend from college. A bright, sharp kid who had gone on to become a senior investigator for the National Insurance Crime Bureau. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I knew if anyone could help me navigate this, it was him. I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. "Sterling." I took a breath. "David, it's Elias Vance, Julian's father." There was a pause, then a softer tone. "Elias, I am so sorry for your loss." I was shocked when I heard. I cut straight to the point. My voice was low and steady. "David, I appreciate that. But something is wrong with Julian's death. Terribly wrong. I need help from someone who understands how these things really work." The doorbell rang precisely at 9 the next morning. David Sterling stood on my porch, a stark contrast to the quiet grief that had settled over my home. He was younger than I remembered from Julian's college photos, with a sharp, focused energy that seemed to cut through the stillness. His handshake was firm, his eyes direct. He didn't offer empty condolences. He was here to work. I led him into my study, the one room in the house that was truly mine, lined with books on finance and history. The air smelled of old paper and freshly brewed coffee. We sat in the worn leather chairs opposite each other, my desk a silent barrier between us. David got straight to the point, pulling a slim tablet from his briefcase. His voice was low and professional. "I looked into the policy, Elias. It's a $5 million term life policy. It was taken out 18 months ago." He paused, letting the weight of the number settle in the room. $5 million. The figure felt obscene, a grotesque valuation placed on my son's life. David continued, "The premiums were all paid on time. The beneficiary is clear, no contingencies. It's Chloe, 100%. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. I simply nodded my face, a mask of calm I did not feel. Inside, a cold gear clicked into place. This was no longer just a suspicion. This was a motive, the oldest one in the book. I slid the storage unit receipt across the polished wood of the desk. Julian left this for me, I said, my voice even. In his office, tucked into an old ledger I gave him. He knew I valued documentation. He knew I would look. David picked up the receipt, examining it with an expert's eye. He saw what I saw, a potential key to everything. But he also saw the lock. "This is good," he said, placing it carefully back on the desk. "It's a lead. But we have a problem of legal access, Elias." He leaned forward, his focus absolute. "Right now, we have no official cause to investigate. To the world, Julian's death was a tragic accident. To get a warrant for this unit, we'd need probable cause of a crime. This receipt on its own isn't enough." He continued, laying out the walls of the trap we were in. "If we go to the facility and ask for access, they'll ask for Julian's identification and his key. We have neither. If we tell them he's deceased, they will demand a death certificate and the legal papers naming the executor of his estate." He let the final piece fall into place. "And the executor, the person with legal control over everything Julian owned, is Chloe." It was a perfect circle, a legal fortress she had built around her secret. Every official path led directly to her, the one person we had to avoid at all costs. Alerting her would be catastrophic. She would clear out that unit before we could even get a judge to hear our case. The hope I had felt moments before began to curdle into frustration. We had a map, but the door to the treasure was locked, and the dragon held the only key. David left soon after, leaving the scent of stale coffee and the heavy weight of our predicament in the air. I sat in my study for what felt like hours, the receipt for the storage unit lying on the desk like a tombstone. He was right. Chloe had constructed a legal fortress around herself. She was the grieving widow, the executor, the sole beneficiary. On paper, she was the victim. On paper, she held all the power. Every door I could think of had her name on it, and she had locked them all from the inside. I felt a profound sense of helplessness, a feeling I despised. My entire professional life had been dedicated to the principle that no fortress of lies is impenetrable. Every system has a flaw. Every wall has a crack. You just have to have the patience to find it. I picked up the receipt again, forcing myself to stop thinking like a grieving father and start thinking like an auditor. A father sees a clue left by his son. An auditor sees a transaction record. I ignored the name of the storage company, the unit number, the date. My eyes settled on the bottom of the flimsy paper on the line item detailing the payment. "Paid via credit card," it read, followed by an asterisk and 4 digits. 7349. A detail so mundane, so trivial that anyone else would have skimmed right over it. But to a man who has spent a lifetime memorizing numbers, those 4 digits sparked something. A faint echo from a distant past. My mind drifted back 20 years. Julian was heading off to college, a brilliant young man with a bright future but no credit history. I had wanted him to learn financial responsibility, to have a safety net for emergencies. I took him to my bank, the same one I'd used for decades, and added him as an authorized user on an old, rarely used credit card account of mine. I remember the banker explaining it. "He'll have his own card with his own name on it," the man had said. "But you, Mr. Vance, as the primary account holder, are ultimately responsible for the account. You have full legal access and control." I remembered Julian's proud smile as he signed his name on the back of his first credit card. It was an act of paternal trust, a tool to help him build his future. A tool Chloe would never have known existed. Could it be that simple? After all these years, my heart began to beat a little faster. I walked over to the old oak filing cabinet in the corner of my study. My fingers, steady now, found the file labeled Old Accounts. Inside, tucked away in a dusty folder, was the original cardholder agreement from 2 decades ago. I found my card. The last 4 digits were 7349. A perfect match. It wasn't a guess anymore. It was a lead supported by evidence. I moved to my computer, my movements precise and deliberate. I logged into the bank's website, navigating to the credit card portal I hadn't visited in years. The interface was different, modernized, but the core data was all there. I clicked through to the account details, my breath held tight in my chest. And there it was, under a section titled Authorized Users. One name, Julian Vance. With another click, I pulled up the transaction history. I scrolled back month after month past small bookstore purchases from his college days and emergency gas station fill-ups. And then I found the pattern. For the last 6 months, a recurring charge. A monthly payment of $95 to Oak Ridge Secure Storage. The paper trail was complete. It was irrefutable. The contract for that unit, the legal agreement for that space, wasn't truly Julian's. It was mine. A wave of cold, clear certainty washed over me. Chloe's fortress had a back door, and I was holding the master key. She had planned for every contingency based on Julian's life, but she had never thought to look into the financial architecture I had built for him when he was just a boy. I picked up the phone and called David. When he answered, there was no preamble. "I have access, David," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a line on a ledger. "I am the primary account holder. They can't legally deny me." On the other end of the line, there was a moment of silence, and then a low chuckle of pure professional admiration. "Elias," he said, "let's go open that door." The drive to Oak Ridge Secure Storage was a journey into another world, a landscape of corrugated metal and endless asphalt baking under the afternoon sun. David drove his unmarked agency sedan, a nondescript vehicle for a man who specialized in the unseen. I sat in the passenger seat, the world outside blurring into a meaningless backdrop. My focus was singular, narrowed down to a single roll-up metal door in a row of hundreds just like it. David was quiet, respecting the turmoil I was trying to contain. He was a professional, a steady presence in the eye of my personal hurricane. When we arrived, the facility manager, a heavy-set man with a sweat-stained shirt and a skeptical expression, looked us over from behind a plexiglass barrier. I presented my driver's license and the credit card, the plastic feeling impossibly flimsy for the weight it carried. "I'm the primary holder on the account that pays for Unit B17. I stated, my voice devoid of emotion. "I need access." He grunted, tapping at his keyboard. His eyes flicked from the screen to me, then to David, who stood silently behind me, a silent but intimidating presence. "Accounts in the name of Julian Vance," the manager said, a challenge in his tone. "Policy says only the renter gets access." I didn't flinch. "Check the payment details," I said calmly. "Check the cardholder agreement you have on file. The legal contract is with the primary account holder. That's me. I am not asking for his property. I am asking to access the space for which I am financially and legally responsible." It was a carefully worded statement, a truth constructed with an auditor's precision. The manager grumbled, but he knew the law. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a master key and a release form, which I signed with a steady hand. We followed him in his golf cart through the labyrinth of identical buildings until we stopped at B17. The door was a faded, dusty red. He unlocked the heavy padlock, his movements slow and grudging. "You got an hour," he said before driving off, leaving us in the sudden, echoing silence. David and I looked at each other. This was it, the point of no return. With a deep breath, David gripped the handle and pulled. The metal door groaned in protest, then rolled upwards with a deafening clatter, revealing the dark, cool space within. It wasn't large, 10 feet by 10 feet, but it was packed with the evidence of a life in turmoil. A few boxes of books, a drafting table Julian must have loved, and in the center of the floor, a single black duffel bag and a laptop case. David stepped inside first, his senses on high alert. I followed, my heart pounding against my ribs. While David checked the perimeter, I knelt down and unzipped the duffel bag. The contents made the air leave my lungs. There was a passport, a good one with Julian's photo, but the name Alex Miller. Beneath it were stacks of $100 bills bound in rubber bands. I didn't count it, but I knew it was a substantial amount. A burner phone, still in its plastic packaging, lay at the bottom. It was a go bag, an escape kit, the tools of a man planning to disappear. David turned his attention to the laptop case. He opened it, revealing a sleek, modern laptop. He powered it on. It was password protected, but Julian had left another clue. A sticky note was attached to the back of the screen. On it was a single word, Clara. My late wife's name. A pang of love and sorrow shot through me. It was a password Chloe would never guess. Inside the desktop was clean, almost empty except for a few folders. David's fingers moved quickly over the trackpad, his training taking over. He opened the email client first. The story was laid out in cold, digital text. A chain of emails between Chloe Marco and Julian. Chloe's messages were masterpieces of manipulation, a blend of veiled threats and false promises. She spoke of their plan for a new life funded by the insurance money. She was the clear architect of the entire scheme. We saw Julian's replies becoming shorter, more desperate. Then we found the leverage she was using. In a separate folder were screenshots of online gambling sites showing Julian's account deep in the red. He owed a dangerous amount of money to people who don't take kindly to delays. Chloe hadn't just seduced him into a plan. She had blackmailed him. Cooperate, or she would expose his debts and ruin him completely. Then David found the last piece of the puzzle. It was a single audio file on the desktop labeled simply Dad. My blood ran cold. David looked at me, a question in his eyes. I just nodded. He double-clicked the file, and then my son's voice filled the small, dusty space. It was raw, terrified, and broken in a way I had never heard before. Dad, he began, his voice cracking. If you're hearing this, it means I did it. I followed her plan. I had to. I messed up, Dad. So bad. Gambling. I owe so much money. Chloe found out. She and her friend Marco, they came up with this. Fake my death, get the insurance money, pay off the debts, and we all disappear. He took a ragged breath. But it's not like that. I see the way she looks at me now. I'm just a means to an end. Once she has that money, I'm a loose end. I'm so scared. I didn't know who else to turn to. I didn't know how to tell you. The recording ended with a choked sob and a desperate whispered plea that would be seared into my memory forever. Dad, please, save me from her. The audio ended, but the silence that followed was deafening. The grief I had felt at his funeral was nothing compared to this. This was a living nightmare. The fury at Chloe was a white-hot fire, but beneath it, a new, unshakable purpose was forged. My mission had changed. This was no longer about uncovering a financial crime. It was no longer about justice for a dead son. My son was alive, and I was going to bring him home. My study, once a quiet place for reflection, transformed into a command center. The silence was no longer one of grief, but of intense, focused work. The audio file of my son's voice was a permanent echo in my mind, a constant fuel for the cold fire that now burned within me. David, working from a laptop connected to a secure network, became the tip of the spear. He was my window into a world of surveillance and data I couldn't access. He spent hours on encrypted calls, his language a clipped shorthand of agency speak. He spoke of liaising with federal contacts in Mexico, of cross-referencing flight manifests and hotel guest lists. He was mapping their movements, turning their carefree vacation into a grid of predictable data points. While David hunted them in the physical world, I began my own hunt in the digital one. With David's legal oversight, I delved into the labyrinth of Julian's finances. It was a place I had intentionally avoided for years, respecting my son's independence. Now I entered it as a forensic auditor, and what I found was not the result of mismanagement, but a systematic and deliberate demolition. I worked for 2 days straight, fueled by black coffee and a grim determination. Bank statements, credit card bills, and loan applications became my whole world. I laid them out across my large oak desk, the paper trail of a life being slowly and expertly bled dry. I built a spreadsheet, my fingers moving across the keyboard, with a muscle memory I thought I had lost to retirement. In the neat columns and rows, a story emerged. It began subtly years ago, shortly after Julian and Chloe married. Small things. A new credit card opened in Julian's name that I knew he didn't need. A steady increase in spending at high-end boutiques and exclusive restaurants. Then the pattern escalated. Cash withdrawals from ATMs near casinos in Las Vegas and Atlantic City. Larger personal loans taken out against the equity of their home, the reasons listed as renovations that were never done. I saw how Chloe had systematically isolated Julian's finances, creating a web of debt so tangled, so complex that he must have felt like he was drowning. She wasn't just spending his money. She was siphoning his future, leveraging his name and his credit to fund a lifestyle that was a complete fiction. On the third day, David got the break we needed. He hung up a call, a hard, grim look on his face. "I got a hit on Marco," he said, turning his laptop screen towards me. "Our friend the gardener has a real name. It's Marcus Bell, and he has a record." On the screen was a mugshot from 5 years ago in Florida. Marcus Bell younger, but with the same smug look. 2 priors for fraud, David explained. His pattern is to work with a female partner to target wealthy, emotionally vulnerable individuals. He's not a gardener, Elias. He's a professional predator. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't just an affair. This was a long con. Chloe hadn't fallen for a con man. She had partnered with one. My son wasn't just a victim of a bad marriage. He was the target of a planned operation. The life insurance policy wasn't a desperate solution to a recent problem. It was the endgame. It had always been the endgame. My son wasn't her husband. He was her asset to be leveraged, drained, and then liquidated for a final massive payout. The numbers on my spreadsheet didn't lie. They screamed, and I was finally ready to listen. The period of quiet, methodical work came to an abrupt end 4 days later. David called me, his voice tight with a new urgency. "She's back, Elias. Chloe flew into JFK last night." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The game had just accelerated. Chloe did not return quietly. She returned with a performance worthy of an award. The local news ran a small piece about the tragic death of a promising local architect. And there she was, stepping out of a black car in front of her house, dressed in a tailored black suit, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She looked every bit the devastated widow leaning on Marco's arm for support, a perfect picture of grief and vulnerability. It was a nauseating spectacle. I watched it on my computer, my hands clasped so tightly on my desk that my knuckles were white. The disgust was a physical thing, a bitter taste in my mouth. She wasn't just lying. She was turning my son's memory into a stage for her own theater of greed. Her performance, however, was just the opening act. The next day, the escalation began. I received a call from an old neighbor, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, who had known Julian since he was a boy. Her voice was hesitant, laced with confusion. "Elias," she said, "I don't mean to bother you in your time of grief, but there's a for sale sign on Julian's lawn." I thanked her for the information, my voice remaining level, but after I hung up, I drove over there myself. And there it was, a large garish sign from a high-end real estate firm, its bright colors an insult to the quiet street. It felt like a desecration, a violation of a place that should have been a sanctuary for my son's memory. She was not just moving on, she was erasing him. The next piece of news came from David. His sources were working efficiently. "She's not just selling the house, Elias," he said over the phone, his tone grim. "She's contacted an estate liquidator. They're scheduled to come in next week to appraise and clear out all of Julian's personal assets." I closed my eyes, a wave of profound sorrow washing over me. I pictured Julian's office, his books, his drafting table where he had spent countless hours bringing his visions to life. I remembered the day I helped him set up his first small studio, the pride in his eyes, as he carefully arranged his specialized pens and tools. To Chloe, those were not the cherished instruments of a brilliant architect, the extensions of his mind and his passion. They were just items on a list inventory to be converted into cash as quickly as possible. Every action she took was designed to liquidate Julian's life, to turn his existence into a single clean number in a bank account. But it was David's final piece of intelligence that turned the pressure into a ticking clock. He came over that evening, forgoing the phone for a face-to-face conversation. My contact at North Star Mutual called me, he said, his expression serious. Chloe's lawyer is a shark. He's been pressuring them daily, citing her financial distress and emotional trauma. He's managed to get the claim expedited. I looked at him, waiting for the final blow. They're not going to take the standard 90 days to process it, Elias. They've scheduled the final signing. We don't have months. We have 2 weeks. He let that sink in. 14 days from today, Chloe will walk into their corporate office, sign a single piece of paper, and $5 million will be transferred to her account. And then she and Marcus Bell will be ghosts. The quiet of my study suddenly felt suffocating. The abstract timeline of our investigation had just collapsed into a concrete deadline. 14 days. It was a race against time, not just to expose a crime, but to find and save my son before the woman who had orchestrated his death could finally cash the check. The time for gathering evidence was over. It was time to find Julian. The ticking clock had a sound, a relentless metronome counting down the seconds we had left. The question was no longer what Chloe had done, but where Julian was hiding. David and I turned our full attention back to the laptop we'd recovered from the storage unit. We were looking for a ghost. A man who was officially dead, yet still existed somewhere. We scoured every file, every deleted document, looking for a breadcrumb. We found it in the browser history. It was a transaction from 3 weeks ago, a single online purchase for a $500 prepaid debit card. It was a classic tool for anyone trying to stay off the grid. To Chloe, it would have looked like another one of Julian's insignificant online purchases. To us, it was a lifeline. David used his resources to track the card. It had been activated 2 days after the purchase, and it had been used only once to buy gasoline and a coffee at a lonely, isolated gas station off a highway in West Texas, a place called Sanderson, a town so small it was little more than a speck on the map. There was only one motel in the town, the Lone Star Inn. It had to be him. David looked at me, his expression all business. "I can make a call to the local sheriff's department," he said. "They can have a car there in 20 minutes. I held up a hand, stopping him. "No," I said, my voice firm. "No police. Not yet. He's terrified. If he sees a uniform, he'll run. This is something a father has to do. I'm going alone." David started to protest, but he saw the look in my eyes and fell silent. He understood. This wasn't about making an arrest. This was about bringing my son back from the dead. The flight to El Paso and the subsequent 3-hour drive through the vast, empty expanse of the Texas desert was a crucible. The landscape was beautiful and brutal, a flat sun-scorched earth under an endless blue sky. It gave me time to think, to push past the anger and focus on the mission. I wasn't going there to condemn my son for his weakness. I was going there to offer him the one thing he thought he had lost forever, a way out. The Lone Star Inn was exactly as I'd pictured. A single-story U-shaped building with peeling white paint and a flickering neon sign that buzzed in the twilight. I found the name Alex Miller in the guest register. Room 12, at the end of the row. I walked to the door, my heart a heavy, slow drum in my chest. I knocked twice. I heard a shuffle from within, then silence. I knocked again, firmer this time. "Julian," I said, my voice low but clear. "It's me. It's your father. I'm alone." There was another long pause, then the sound of a chain being unlatched. The door creaked open a few inches. The man peering out was a ghost of my son. He was gaunt, his face covered in a patchy beard, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The confident, successful architect was gone. In his place was a fugitive hollowed out by fear. He stared at me as if I were an apparition. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse. How I didn't answer. I just looked at him. "Let me in, son." He stumbled back, letting the door swing open. The room was small and smelled of stale cigarette smoke and despair. Clothes were piled on a chair, and empty food containers littered a small table. He sank onto the edge of the unmade bed, his head in his hands. And then it all came pouring out. He broke down completely, his body shaking with racking sobs. He told me everything. The gambling debts that had spiraled out of control. The shame that had kept him from asking for my help. He told me how Chloe had discovered his secret, and how her initial sympathy had curdled into a cold, calculated opportunity. He described her threats, her partnership with Marco, and the suffocating sense of being trapped with no way out. He confessed that he had been too weak, too scared to stand up to her. He was a man who had lost control of his own life, and he knew it. I let him speak, listening to every painful word without interruption. I let him empty himself of all the poison, all the fear and guilt he had been carrying alone. When he was finished, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing in the small, dim room. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading, expecting anger, expecting condemnation. I gave him neither. I knelt down in front of him, so we were at eye level. "I know, Julian," I said softly. "I found the laptop. I heard your message." Relief and shame warred on his face. He had been heard. He was no longer alone in his nightmare. I placed a hand on his shoulder, my grip firm and steady. "I'm here to bring you home, Julian," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "But our way home is through this. There's no running. You have to trust me. And you have to do exactly as I say." Through his tears, he looked at me, and for the first time since I had arrived, I saw not a fugitive but my son. And he nodded. The journey back from Texas was a silent one. Julian sat beside me in the passenger seat, staring out at the blur of the highway, a man caught between two worlds, the one he was running from and the one he was reluctantly running towards. The fear was still in his eyes, but beneath it I saw something new, a flicker of resolve. He had made a choice. He had placed his trust in me, and I would not fail him. Back in my study, the atmosphere shifted. The quiet hum of investigation was replaced by the sharp, decisive energy of an impending operation. Our war room was now focused on a single objective, setting the perfect trap. David was the architect of this operation, and he worked with a chilling efficiency. He spent a full day on a series of secure calls, leveraging the full weight of his position at the NICB. I listened as he coordinated with contacts at the FBI's white-collar crime division and with the internal security team at North Star Mutual, Julian's insurance company. He wasn't just requesting help, he was directing a multi-agency effort. The plan was as elegant as it was ruthless. They would use Chloe's own greed as the bait. David himself made the call to her lawyer. Posing as a senior vice president from the insurance company's complex claims department, his voice was a smooth blend of corporate sympathy and official authority. He explained that given the tragic circumstances, and in light of Mrs. Vance's understandable distress, the company had decided to expedite the final payout. He spoke of the company's commitment to its clients in their time of need. He told the lawyer that a certified check for the full $5 million would be ready for collection in 1 week's time. All that was required was for Mrs. Vance to come to their corporate headquarters in downtown Houston to sign the final disbursement papers in person. It was a formality, he explained, for a payout of this magnitude. As I listened, I could almost feel the lawyer's own greed vibrating through the phone. He assured David that his client would be there. The bait was taken. The next step was to set the stage. The meeting would take place in a glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor of the North Star Mutual Tower, a sterile, imposing fortress of corporate power. David arranged for 2 senior FBI agents, a man and a woman, who had spent years undercover in the financial world, to be in that room. They wouldn't look like cops. They would look like what they were pretending to be: a seasoned corporate lawyer and a top-level insurance executive. They had the suits, the watches, and the air of casual authority that would put Chloe and Marco completely at ease. They were the ones who would slide the final papers across the polished table. They were the ones who would witness the final irrefutable act of attempted fraud. My role in this was to prepare Julian. He was the weapon, but he was a fragile one. The night before the meeting, I sat with him in my study. He was pale, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can do this, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "To walk in there, to see her." I looked at him not with pity, but with a father's unwavering resolve. "You are not the same man who fled to Texas, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "That man was a victim. The man who walks into that room tomorrow is the key to his own salvation. You are not there to confront her. You are there to end this. You are there to start over." I walked him through the plan one last time. He and I would be in an adjacent office with a one-way mirror watching the entire scene unfold. We would wait. We would watch her greet the agents. We would watch her sit down, her victory just moments away. We would wait until the very last second, until her pen physically touched the signature line on that paper. That was the final undeniable act, the point of no return. Then and only then would we make our move. The plan was a perfectly balanced equation, every variable accounted for. All that was left was to solve it. The house was quiet. The meticulous plans were finalized. The players were in position, and all that was left was the slow, heavy passage of time until morning. David had gone home to get a few hours of sleep, leaving Julian and me in the soft glow of my study's desk lamp. We sat in silence for a long time, the city lights twinkling like a distant, unfeeling galaxy outside the window. Julian finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper, thick with a shame that was painful to hear. "Dad." He started, not looking at me. "Why, after what I let happen? After I betrayed your trust? Let this woman nearly destroy our family? Why are you doing all this for me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and raw. He was asking for an explanation, but what he was really asking for was a reason to believe he was worth saving. I didn't answer right away. Instead, my mind went back to a sunny afternoon almost 30 years ago. Julian was 9 years old. I had taken him to a park, and I was watching from a bench as he played near a cluster of oak trees. A group of older, bigger boys cornered him. I saw them push him, saw their cruel laughter. Every instinct in me screamed to run over there, to intervene, to be the protective father. I even stood up. But something made me wait. I saw the look on Julian's face. It wasn't terror. It was calculation. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't cry out. He suddenly pointed behind the biggest boy and yelled, "Hey, look out, a bee swarm!" The boys, startled, flinched and turned. In that split second of confusion, Julian didn't run away, screaming. He just calmly walked around them and kept going, leaving them to swat at imaginary insects. I brought my focus back to the present, to the man sitting across from me who was once that clever little boy. "When you were 9, I said softly, I saw 3 boys corner you at the park. I was about to step in, but I waited. I saw a flicker of memory in his eyes. You didn't fight them. You outsmarted them. I was never more proud of you than I was in that moment." I leaned forward, my voice low and certain. "Your strength was never in your fists, Julian. It's in your mind. Chloe and Marco, they are just bullies on a playground, only bigger. They think they have you cornered with threats and force." I paused, letting the words sink in. I didn't raise a fighter son. I raised a survivor. And tomorrow we survive this together. He finally looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. It wasn't forgiveness I was offering him, not yet. It was a reminder of who he was. And in the quiet of that room, I saw the scared fugitive from Texas disappear, and in his place my son began to reappear. He nodded a single resolute gesture. The stage was set. We were ready. The day of the reckoning arrived with a cold, gray dawn. We drove to downtown Houston in silence, the city's glass and steel towers rising around us like silent, indifferent judges. The North Star Mutual building was a monument to corporate power, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the stroke of a pen. It was the perfect stage for the final act. In the lobby, we met David, who was dressed in a sharp suit, looking every bit the high-powered executive. He led Julian to a small private office adjacent to the main conference room, a space equipped with a one-way mirror. I clasped my son's shoulder one last time. His hand was cold, but his eyes were steady. He was ready. I followed David to the 34th floor. My heart was a steady, cold drum against my ribs. Beneath my shirt, taped to my skin, was a small digital recording device, a silent witness to the truth. David opened the heavy glass door to the conference room, and I stepped inside, my posture slightly stooped, my face a carefully constructed mask of weary grief. They were already there. Chloe and Marco sat on one side of a vast, polished mahogany table, looking out at the panoramic view of the city below. Chloe was dressed in expensive, somber black, a vision of tragic elegance. Marco sat beside her, his hand resting possessively on her chair, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. They turned as I entered, and Chloe's expression softened into one of practiced sympathy. "Elias," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "I'm so glad you could be here." She saw my presence not as a threat, but as the final seal of her victory, the defeated patriarch coming to witness the transfer of his family's legacy into her hands. 2 other people were in the room the FBI agents David had arranged. A man with silver hair and an authoritative presence introduced himself as Mr. Davies, the head of the legal department. The woman, sharp and impeccably dressed, was Ms. Albright, a senior vice president. They played their parts to perfection, offering me their condolences and speaking in the calm, measured tones of corporate power. The room was cold, the air conditioned to a precise degree. For the next 20 minutes, I sat in silence, playing the role of the broken old man, nodding at the appropriate times as the agents went through the final legal jargon with Chloe and her lawyer, who was attending via speakerphone. I could feel Chloe's eyes on me, occasionally checking to see if I was maintaining my performance. I kept my gaze fixed on my hands folded on the table in front of me, allowing her to believe she was in complete control. Finally, the moment arrived. Mr. Davies slid a thick, expensive-looking document across the table. "This is the final settlement agreement." "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice formal, "if you could just sign on the indicated line, we can authorize the wire transfer immediately." I watched as Chloe's eyes lit up, a flicker of pure, unadulterated greed that she couldn't quite conceal. She picked up the heavy gold-plated fountain pen that Ms. Albright offered her. This was it. The culmination of all her lies, all her manipulation, was just one signature away. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city far below. I watched her hand the pen poised over the paper. She glanced at me one last time, a triumphant little smirk playing on her lips. In that instant, as the nib of the pen made contact with the paper, leaving the first trace of black ink, I broke my silence. I lifted my head and looked directly into her eyes, my own voice no longer the tired murmur of a grieving father, but a cold, clear instrument of judgment. "Everything has its price, Chloe," I said. The words sliced through the quiet of the room. I saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes. The tone was wrong. The words were wrong. It wasn't the voice of the man she thought she had beaten. Before she could process what was happening, The conference room door swung open. Julian stepped inside. He was not the ghost from the Texas motel, nor the dead man from the funeral. He was clean-shaven, dressed in a simple, neat suit, looking directly at the woman who had tried to erase him. He was alive. The pen dropped from Chloe's fingers, clattering onto the polished table, and the color drained from her face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The silence in the room was a physical thing, a vacuum created by the impossible sight of my living son. The gold fountain pen, a moment ago the instrument of Chloe's triumph, lay abandoned on the polished table next to her half-formed signature. For a frozen second, no one moved. Chloe's face was a canvas of cascading emotions, first a flicker of confusion, then a wave of pure, uncomprehending shock, which finally curdled into the dawning, sickening horror of a chess master who has just realized they've been in checkmate for the last 10 moves. Marco, the professional grifter, reacted differently. His smug confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by the flat, dead-eyed look of a predator caught in a trap. His eyes darted toward the door, his instincts screaming for an escape that he knew would never come. Julian stepped fully into the room, his presence filling the space. He looked not at me, but directly at the 2 federal agents pretending to be executives. His voice was steady, gaining strength with every word. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he said, the statement clear and formal. "As the insured party, I am here to report a crime. This claim is fraudulent. And this woman," he said, finally turning his gaze to Chloe, "is the one who orchestrated it." That was the signal. The entire atmosphere of the room shifted. Mr. Davies, the silver-haired man who had been the picture of corporate law, stood up. He was no longer a lawyer. His posture was different. His voice hard as steel. "Chloe Vance, Marcus Bell." He said his words sharp and precise. "My name is Special Agent Harris with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, mail fraud, and wire fraud." As he spoke, the conference room door opened again, and 2 more agents dressed in plain clothes stepped inside. Miss Albright, the vice president, produced a pair of handcuffs from her jacket. Chloe finally broke. A strangled animal sound escaped her throat, but it wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a universe imploding. She didn't fight, she didn't argue. She simply collapsed in on herself, her perfect facade shattering into a million pieces. Marco was silent, a statue of resignation. He knew the game. He had played it before, but this time he had lost. As the agents efficiently and dispassionately cuffed their hands behind their backs, reading them their Miranda rights, I watched the woman who had brought so much chaos and pain to my family. There was no victory in that moment, no sense of triumph. There was only a profound and hollow sadness. I watched them be led away, 2 ghosts, leaving the pristine sunlit room, their grand ambition reduced to a criminal file number. The months that followed were not about celebration, but about a quiet and difficult reconstruction. The evidence was overwhelming. My testimony, David's investigation, the contents of the laptop, and Julian's full confession created an ironclad case. Chloe and Marco were sentenced to significant terms in federal prison for their crimes. There would be no more beachside cocktails, no more easy money. Their ledger was finally balanced with the cold, hard currency of consequence. For his complete cooperation, Julian received a far lighter sentence, 5 years of probation and 2,000 hours of community service. There was no escaping his accountability, nor should there have been. He sold the glass and steel house, that monument to Chloe's greed, and used the money to painstakingly pay back every dollar of the gambling debts that had started this nightmare. He works for a small local architectural firm, now designing community centers and libraries instead of luxury condos. He lives in a simple apartment downtown. His life is smaller, quieter, but it is his own. Last weekend, I went over to his place. In his small backyard, we worked on rebuilding an old wooden armchair, one that had belonged to my wife Clara. We didn't talk much. We just worked the silence comfortable, the shared task of sanding down the old scarred wood and fitting the joints back together, saying more than words ever could. As we finished, he ran his hand over the smooth, restored arm of the chair. He looked at me, his eyes clear for the first time in years. "Thank you, Dad," he said. I simply nodded. It was enough. I spent my life as an auditor believing that the world could be understood through numbers, that every debt could be tallied and every account settled. But I learned that the most important ledgers are not written in ink. They are the invisible accounts of trust and betrayal, of love and responsibility we keep with the people who matter most. My son's account was deeply in the red, a catastrophic loss I had failed to see. But you don't just write off a debt like that. You don't close the book. You do the hard, quiet work of reconciliation. You sand down the rough edges, you brace what is broken, and you build again. Not for victory, not for revenge, but for the simple, profound peace of seeing a balance sheet made whole once more. The moment Julian stepped into the room, the world stopped. Chloe's face, which had been a mask of triumphant greed, simply broke. It wasn't a gradual change. It was an instant shattering. The color drained away, leaving a ghastly waxen canvas of pure shock. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Marco was different. The smug satisfaction on his face vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stillness. He didn't look shocked. He looked like a wolf that had just felt the steel jaws of a trap snap shut on its leg. His eyes for a split second flickered to the door, a primal instinct to flee, but he knew. The game was over. Then the room itself seemed to change. Mr. Davies and Miss Albright, the two people who had been the picture of corporate authority, stood up in unison. Their movements were no longer the relaxed gestures of executives. They were sharp, precise, and economical. There was a new hardness in their eyes. Mr. Davies reached into his jacket, and what he pulled out was not a pen, but a small leather wallet containing a gleaming gold badge. "Chloe Vance, Marcus Bell," he said, his voice no longer smooth and corporate, but cold and commanding. "Special Agent Harris, FBI. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud and wire fraud." Ms. Albright produced a pair of handcuffs as she mirrored his statement. It was the word arrest that finally animated Chloe. A choked, guttural sound tore from her throat as she seemed to shrink into her chair, a puppet whose strings had all been cut at once. The elegant, powerful woman who had commanded the room moments before was gone, replaced by a whimpering, defeated fraud. She didn't cry or scream. She simply disintegrated, her perfect illusion collapsing into a pile of ugly truth. Marco, on the other hand, was utterly still. He placed his hands on the table in front of him, a gesture of complete and total surrender. He had lost, and he knew the protocol. The agents were professional and swift, cuffing their hands behind their backs with a series of metallic clicks that echoed in the silent, sunlit room. The finality of it was absolute. There was no argument, no plea. There was only the quiet, efficient machinery of justice, closing a file that had remained open for far too long. The months that followed were not about victory, but about the quiet, difficult work of reconstruction. The legal proceedings were swift. The evidence we had gathered was overwhelming and undeniable. Chloe and Marcus Bell were handed long federal sentences, their futures reduced to the sterile confines of a prison cell, a fitting end to a life built on deceit. Their names faded from the headlines, becoming just another cautionary tale. Julian, for his full and immediate cooperation, received a plea agreement. There were consequences, as there should be. He was given 5 years of probation and a significant amount of community service. Justice required accountability, and my son did not shy away from it. He sold the cold glass and steel house, that monument, to Chloe's ambition, and used every last penny to pay back the debts that had chained him to her. He now works for a small architectural firm that designs community parks and public libraries. His life is smaller, quieter. He lives in a humble apartment that is filled with his own books and his own sketches. He is no longer living a life designed to impress others. He is finally living a life that is authentically his own. He is free. Last Saturday, I went to visit him. I found him in the small shared backyard of his apartment building, working under the shade of an old oak tree. He was carefully sanding down the arm of a worn wooden chair, one that had belonged to my late wife, Clara. I didn't say anything. I just pulled up another chair, picked up a piece of sandpaper, and started working on one of the legs. We worked like that for over an hour in a comfortable, healing silence. The only sounds were the rasp of the sandpaper against the old wood and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. We were not just fixing a broken piece of furniture. We were rebuilding something together, smoothing out the rough, scarred surfaces of the past. When we were finished, he ran his hand over the newly smooth wood. He looked up at me, his eyes clear, and his expression one of a man who was finally at peace. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice quiet, but full of a meaning that no grand speech could ever capture. I simply nodded and placed my hand on his shoulder. Our relationship was being rebuilt not with easy words of forgiveness, but with the quiet, steady work of our hands. Peace had finally been restored. I spent a lifetime balancing ledgers, believing every truth could be found in columns of numbers. This ordeal taught me that the most important accounts are not written on paper, but are the invisible ledgers of trust we keep within our families. For too long, I ignored the discrepancies in my son's life, choosing a false peace over the hard truth the data was screaming at me. I learned that a true accounting requires courage, the courage to investigate the painful details, to expose the fraud, and to do the quiet, necessary work of restoring the balance. If you believe in the quiet strength it takes to uncover the truth, please support this channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts on this story in the comments.